Hello everybody, welcome to another video. Today it is the 16th of January. Today we're doing a frontline update, but we're going to begin by looking at the striking of two Russian aircraft in the western Sea of Azov, just off the coast of Kherson Oblast, and what was reported to be around the village of Strelkove. And so this was reported on the night of January 14th, when claims began to circulate from a source in the Ukrainian MOD about the loss of a Russian Beriev A-50 airborne early warning and control system and an Ilyushin IL-22M airborne command post. And the Ukrainian MOD on the 15th of January claimed responsibility for striking both of those aircraft, but did not mention the way in which they did that. Meanwhile, the consensus from Russian military bloggers is that it was a friendly fire incident. And in particular, you had the Fighter Bomber Telegram channel, which is this popular Russian channel, which likely does have connections to the Russian Air Force, again validate the claim that it was a friendly fire incident, and actually mentioned that there was a third aircraft attacked in the same incident, which might have actually been a Su-34 that was in a bombing mission and ended up evading the attacks during the friendly fire incident. At the same time, Fighter Bomber does say that 11 or 12 military pilots were killed in the incident, which is significant as these are pilots in some of Russia's most prized intelligence aircraft, and these are likely pilots with extensive training and experience. So in the case of the A-50, that one was completely destroyed and is likely submerged in the western Sea of Azov. And then looking at the IL-22, it was actually able to make an emergency landing in the airfield in Anapa. So in this photo, you could see what occurred after the landing. You could see the extent of the damage, all the punctures in the tail section. You could also see that there was a call from the pilots in the IL-22 before landing for firefighters and for ambulance, and so there probably was some sort of casualty, but the successful emergency landing was important in saving the lives of many of the pilots that were in this particular aircraft, although the same thing cannot be said for the A-50. Now, just to quickly look into the significance of the loss of the A-50, it was crucial for Russian air and air defense activity. It did give the Russians the ability to spot incoming cruise missiles, drones, and low-altitude Ukrainian jets, and also gave situational awareness to Russian surface-to-air missile batteries. Additionally, both platforms are important for relaying information from the rear headquarters of the Russian MOD to the front line, talking about intelligence and general communication between the front and the rear, which is important for cohesiveness. And so the Russians do actually have replacements to the A-50 in particular. They have 9 A-50s and A-50Us, which are the modernized version in service. And there are at least 12 of the modernized IL-22 airborne command posts. But now with this most recent round of strikes, we could say that there are only 8 operational A-50s and 11 operational IL-22Ms, although it is possible to modify earlier iterations of the Ilyushin and turn them into the modernized version of the IL-22, although that does, of course, take a lot of time and money. We're going to begin by looking at the Kherson front, specifically at the Krynky bridgehead, where from the 8th and the 13th of January, the Russian forces renewed assaults on the bridgehead from one particular direction. For the past month, they've been launching attacks from several directions, but the most recent round that was recorded by Ukraine's 501st Marine Battalion of the 36th Marine Brigade occurred from one road in particular, this one starting in Kherson, that goes through the easternmost part of Krynky, where the Russians do have forward operating bases in the warehouses and the trenches. It's like this organizing point for the infantry and for the armored columns. And then from there, they advance along this main road into the center part of Krynky, where you have the Ukrainian main defensive node of several hundred Marines located in the basements or the ruins of the houses or whatever trenches the Russians left over or that the Ukrainians built up themselves under heavy artillery bombardment. And so based on the footage from the 501st, we can see that the Russians are sending in many armored columns, but again, in terms of the size, it's like 4 to 5 each, that are going accompanied by small infantry squads, and it's now backed up by geolocated footage, which gives us an idea of where the Russians were advancing, and it does show us that the Russians have been able to slowly chip away at the eastern portions of the bridgehead. At the same time, the 501st Battalion, their FPV drone crews were successful in targeting several vehicles. So in the recent round of videos released, There's 3 hits, direct hits on Russian tanks and several other hits on Russian infantry that was advancing, likely in order to dislodge the Ukrainians from their positions in the central parts of the village. And so for now, the Ukrainians are totally on a defensive posture. There's no discussion of even sending mechanized assets across the river or expanding the offensive. Really, the idea now is just to hold the line, and as they do that, to try to treat the Russian forces to increase the amount of vehicular losses, because really now you don't have many Ukrainian vehicle losses because they're not sending any such equipment across the river. Some is probably being struck on the rear, but for the most part, the Russians are the ones conducting the offensive activity in this region, so it is understandable that they would have more losses when it comes to heavy equipment. But then when it comes to the actual infantry, that's the danger for the Ukrainians, as it is very difficult for them, and it always has been, as has been reported by the Ukrainians and by our channel and many others across the Dnieper River. The logistical situation makes it very difficult, with the Russians now heavily targeting a lot of the forested area in between the Dnieper River, the Krynky River, and then the Krynky bridgehead itself. And then just by looking at the newest round of satellite imagery from Krynky, you'll see that a lot of the houses are completely devastated. Of course, there are still remnants that are being used, but for the most part, you do have to stay put within the basements. So it really is just a difficult condition for those soldiers stationed in that region. Looking at Novomykhailivka, there was a video released on the 15th of January, which does show a Ukrainian assault on one of Russia's forwardmost trenches. So the trench itself is built in an area that is on the flanks of Russia's main salient of attack around Novomykhailivka, as at first the main vector of attack for the Russians was along this main road and along several other tree lines. And so this is one of just the flanks protecting that Russian advance. And another important piece of why the Ukrainians would be interested in disrupting the Russian continuity of their front line in this particular blue marker is because it is one of Russia's closest positions to the road that connects Konstantinivka to Vuhledar and the wider Donetsk Ukrainian defensive network, as you can see when you zoom out. And so that would be the rationale behind the Ukrainians then moving in with their own infantry fighting vehicles and dismounting Ukrainian soldiers that attempted to storm the Russian trenches that are located over here. So that trench is marked in the red. In terms of the end result, I can't speak to that because it is a 14-minute video linked in here, which does show the back and forth between the Russian and Ukrainians. Lane mines are involved. You have small arms fire clashes between both sides. And then the video cuts out before we can make a conclusive statement. But what the Russian side does claim is that they were able to eventually repel that Ukrainian assault. And there's really no word yet that I've seen from the Ukrainians talking about a successful counterattack on the flank of the Russian Novomykhailivka attempted salient. And so we're going to have to wait and see if there was actually any change to the front line over here, or if it was just a repelled attack in the end. And now we're going to move on to the situation around Marinka, where there is just a small update, as there was a video released by the 46th Air Assault Brigade, which is now a unit that's being given more and more responsibilities in the Marinka sector. Can't even call it Marinka anymore. You have to call it Jerebets, as now the Russian forces have advanced even deeper into that village. They have advanced from their original positions, from the ruins of the church, and have now reached this next road in Jerebets. So again, you could see the grueling process, and you could see that it's being challenged at every step of the way by Ukraine's FPV drones, which are attempting to strike the Russian forces as they advance through the open or through the ruins. Again, very similar to Krynky, there's a lot of basements in this region that are turning into the forward operating bases for small infantry squads, but nonetheless, the Russians were able to advance in that direction. Looking at Avdiivka, there's not much to add besides a refresher on what's going on around Stepove, because there is some new footage over here from the Ukrainian 47th Mechanized Brigade and their strike drone company, which is not their only drone unit. They have several of them that I've added to my map and shown in previous videos. This is a new one. This is apparently just company-sized unit, but the Ukrainians do have a lot of these FPV drone units that are involved, especially in defending the northern flank of Avdiivka. So the Russian forces in Stepove have had a permanent presence in the easternmost part of the village for really over a month now, maybe even more by now. And the goal was to use that as a springboard to get control of the rest of the village, of course, but also to then go on, advance along supply lines, cut off Bridgehead, for instance, which is a key supply hub for the Ukrainians, which connects the entire Donbas rear with the northern flank of Avdiivka and the Coke Plains. But really, over the past few weeks, we've seen how the front line has stabilized, with really no side being able to gain the initiative around Stepova, which is really becoming a kill zone for both sides, as it is an open area where you do have both sides, infantry fighting vehicles and FPV drones engaging with the infantry, and it's becoming very difficult for any sort of side to garner a large concentration of forces to continue pushing forward. And so what you really have is a continuation of the status quo, where you do have small Russian forces that are situating themselves within the easternmost buildings and within their basements. That's really where they can only stay, because a lot of the houses are just completely damaged. And so staying in those basements, that also does create an issue, because there were openings for those basements that have to be fortified. And whenever there's an opening in those basements, FPV drones and the skilled, trained crew members are able to enter the drones into the opening, the hatch, and cause destruction to whatever force is staying within those lodging areas. And so there were incidents that were recorded on camera over here where the FPV drone hits the basement, the troops get out, and then at that point, it's a completely open area, and then other FPV drones could attack those same infantry. And so that's just a microcosm of the entire explanation for why there's no progress on this front for the Russian side. And at the same time, the Russians did actually understand that it was difficult to push through, and it could be very costly if they even were able to succeed in Stepova. And so that's why we saw them trying to open up new vectors of attack from the flanks. From the south, for instance, there was a pretty significant vector of attack, which did initially yield success. And then later on, there was an attack from the north. But even those ones, eventually, they slowed down. And then the new lines eventually materialized, with the Ukrainians holding their defensive positions in some of the tree lines to the northeast of Bridgehead, which the Ukrainians are ensuring will not fall. They're trying to hold on to it for as long as possible, with a large amount of reserves that were moved into that area. So now moving on to the area around the coke plant, there's not really much to mention over here. I just wanted to mention that I saw some videos from the Ukrainian side, and you could also say the same thing about the Russians, of their improved drone technology, where now they have these drones that are dropping grenades. Of course, they're doing them from closer distances to the targets, which is usually infantry or their dugouts. So for instance, the Ukrainians have been hitting this area in particular at the entrance of the coke plant pretty hard recently. And you also have a higher explosive capacity for the grenades that they're dropping. And you have the drones being moving in motion when they drop the grenades, not always from a 90-degree angle, sometimes from some sort of slanted angle towards the targets. Around Bilohorivka, which, if you don't remember, it's around the Seversk pocket. So within this part of the front line, you actually have a smaller salient that the Ukrainians have created around Bilohorivka that they've been holding on to for a while now, which serves as a forward defensive node to shift attention away from the city of Seversk and towards this town of Bilohorivka. And so this is where you have the Ukrainian 81st Air Assault Brigade defending. They recently released videos of their FPV drones engaging with two Russian vehicles and infantry that were located in the area to the northeast of the village. And so we have the geolocated marker for that. And we also have reports that are coming from Petrenko and Deep State UA, so Ukrainian sources, about a minor Russian advance, improving their tactical positions in the areas that are just to the east of the village, taking over some of the tree lines in the area and fields, trying to position themselves in a better area. And the last advance that I'm going to be mentioning today occurred, I believe, yesterday. It was mentioned by Deep State, just to the east of Novomykhailivka. Novomykhailivka is a village which runs along the Jerebets River. It does have a bridge crossing connecting the two sides of the river, which is important for the Ukrainians for the supply of the bridgehead and for the Russians in terms of destroying it, but also perhaps to use it themselves in the future. So now the Russians are actually pretty close to Novomykhailivka. They are only, when you measure it, about 2.3 kilometers away from that bridge. And when you look at the advance of the Russians, it occurred in some of the ravines in the forested areas, the southeast of Novomykhailivka. In terms of the extent of the advance, as was reported by Petrenko, it was an advance that was 2.2 kilometers wide in its entirety, so something like this basically. And then in terms of how deep it was into the Ukrainian line, it was something like 1.7 kilometers. So just something that I would measure over here on the map. And it really does speak to a broader trend of the Russians uptaking the pressure on the front line along the entire Jerebets River bridgehead in particular, but not to such a great extent that it would cause any collapse of the Ukrainian lines or really compel them to send in a massive amount of reserves. Really, the one time that there was an issue in that regard was when the Russian forces were advancing in the area to the east of Terni. That actually did prompt a Ukrainian fear, and they did move in some reserves into that direction. But for the most part, even with the increase in Russian pressure on this part of the front line, any sort of objectives over here are secondary to the ones that are occurring further south around Donetsk Oblast, which is actually funny because this is a part of Donetsk Oblast, but I'm referring to the one further south around the city of Donetsk. And so that's all I have for today. Thank you guys so much for watching, and I'll see you guys in the next video. Goodbye.